Hello and welcome back, this is ProTailDev. This is the review of the Harvest Mouse Game Jam experience. This is the final video I'm doing on this game jam, and then it's over with. I'm going to be moving on to other projects, other things. I'll have a video, probably already out by now, of explaining kind of where we're going from here. Okay, so let's go straight into this. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to talk about individual aspects of the whole experience, and then I'll look at a before and after, kind of where we ended up, and move on to different sections of how I would normally do this process. So usually on a game I'll have a list now on screen that you can see, but usually I'll start off with an introduction to the whole aspect, of very basic, small description of kind of where the game is, to describe the game and kind of what I want the player to feel. And then I'd have a concept, so I'd have a huge descriptions at each section, where it would describe each kind of concept of the idea. Then I'd go to the game prototype, where we actually started making it from the foundations and moving on all the way through. Finally go through testing, and the last part would obviously be what we're doing now, which is evaluation of the whole thing and maybe a small conclusion. And this is how I would structure it in some kind of document as well. So I would report on all of it, and it's kind of how I'd go over the game. Because this is only a game jam, things aren't going to be concrete. It was only 11 days of working on a game. It wasn't exactly a long-term process. So let's get straight into it. So the first thing we want to look at right now is kind of the whole idea, the planning aspect. I only spent a small amount of time doing the planning, and so it really was not concrete. And that's kind of how I felt with the game jam. I wanted the game jam to be flexible. If we move on to kind of the concept stuff and kind of what we wanted to start off with. So let's move on to the concept of what it was as opposed to what I ended up with. So target audience. Originally I wanted it to be for anyone who wanted to play it during the game jam. I went with a very simple concept in the beginning, and so that it would fit for any target audience. After that, I kind of skipped story because I just didn't feel like there wasn't that much time at the very beginning, so story wasn't a highlight of this game. If it was a narrative game or something along those lines, then I would have spent a lot more time at the beginning thinking about story and like at least basic concepts of the story, not full on writing a story. You don't usually in games write stories and completely flush them out before you've started development on the actual game prototype. Usually it's far before you do that. Usually it's just concepts of maybe where you are and kind of characters, basic characters and things. Then you have the aesthetics, which is what it's going to look like, the style of the game. This varied in different ways. You could see it in the first and second day. It was a while before we went onto the low poly feel, and I was trying to stay away from 3D make my own models and things because I was worried about time, but in the end it worked out. Ended up with a 3D poly low poly theme, and I think it looks quite nice. It suits, and I think I did okay with that. Then you have the characters, which I tried to add a little bit of character to your player by adding the 3D model in there, and kind of adds to the immersion if you've got your own character that you're playing as, and it's a bit easier to see. Character is usually drawn with the story, and so there wasn't much more to it than that. After that, I was thinking of the environment. It started off being more of I think I was going to do something along the lines of, it was only just a tree that you'd have to protect, and you would have to get rid of the bugs that were on the trees, on the plants, and until they fully grew. And the environment itself was just that. It's going to be a tree, maybe small trees around it, and maybe just an island. Obviously that changed to being a bigger island where there were trees scattered all around, more of a natural environment. Still didn't like it, and so ended up with the environment we got at the final section, which was more of a parkour map, encased in this area where you don't really move too much anymore. It's more like you circle around the spirit tree, and the focus is the spirit tree in the center. So I ended up with that, which I think was better, but it made the environment feel less explorable. You felt very much like a linear path, which was unfortunate. I tried my best to add a little bit of extra things, but it was very much a linear path experience as opposed to more of a explore, which would have been the initial goal. Gameplay wise, gameplay mechanics changed quite a lot. So the original idea again was in the concept was to be able to go and get rid of these bugs that were on the tree killing it, and then maybe stop any kind of outside interference and hazards from attacking you. That changed completely with, again, protecting these charging trees that would feed the spirit tree in the center and help that grow instead. So that changed quite a lot. There was a lot of different mechanics. For example, it being a first-person shooter, which as opposed to it being a third person, was a big change as well. And I think it was a good change, because I don't really like third person games that much, because I feel like you can't get as immersed as you would in a first person environment, in a first person shooter. But sometimes that's not what you're going for. If it's a strategy game and you want to be able to see more wider range, then third person is perfect. Just a personal preference. It's fine if you like third person games in that way, and if you can get immersed, then that's perfectly fine. So I decided to change that, and I think it worked really well. Then user interface, originally it was going to be even more simple than I've got it already. So in terms of the UI, I really didn't want there to be any UI. It was just going to be play and quit, menu at the very beginning, and then just go straight in. And there was going to be no UI apart from like the eating bars and maybe some charge bars. After that, that was about it. There wasn't going to be much interaction in between the player and some kind of UI system with buttons. In the end, I actually changed that, and I think it helped with the theme. It helped reinforce the theme of it being more of an enchanted forest, dark and green, and kind of, I think it worked really well with adding things like pause menus, and using the mouse a lot more is pretty standard anyway. I also made sure that the controls for the player were really simplified. And at the very end, I changed one of the keys from R to E, which is more universally accepted as a standard key. And I think it was fine using the controls. I don't think any players would struggle. Then you have the hardware, which the game runs pretty well. It's not exactly a heavy game. It's really straightforward. I managed to optimize a lot of the particles while I was doing them, and make sure that some were turned off while others were. I made sure on the camera that you had culling active so that things would disappear, although there wasn't that much in the scene in the first place, so optimization shouldn't have been a problem for most people's PCs. The game should have run pretty smoothly for most people anyway, so I think that was fine. Then of course you have the content rating, the PEGI content rating, which I try my best to include, especially and make sure that it's always in my mind, and it's something a lot of games miss, but I make sure to follow the rating. Hopefully you can see it on screen of all the different ratings and kind of things to keep in mind. And I'm pretty sure I've excluded most of them, I think all of them, in the middle section where it's warnings. So there's no fear, so there's no jump scares or anything, no gambling, no sex, no violence, no online, which is a bit unfortunate, no online, but that means there's no problems with socialising with another and there being like bad language and stuff. I made sure that it was for everyone, so everyone could play it, because there's no blood or anything. Again, no violence, so everyone could play it. And I think first person shooter wise, you wouldn't get 3-year-olds, but you might do. But they can, because the controls are fairly simple. So you can get all ranges, all the way up to 18 playing it. I don't really see any issues with that. I think my game's very much easy going, easy to learn, so no problems with that. So after the concept, let's move on to the game prototype in that stage where we actually developed the game. So the game overall, I thought it changed very drastically, especially if we go for the iteration 1 aspect where it's all basic code and basic functionality in there. Worked on that at the very beginning, as you noticed in the first few days. It was all about kind of the basic stuff. Then I realised that I wanted a different environment, so I ended up focusing on the level creation a little bit more, which usually is iteration free, but I focused on level creation a little bit because I was so unsure about it, so I wanted to experiment with it earlier. At the same time, I was bringing in assets. The reason why I'd mix these iterations up is because there's just so little time in the game jam for me to be able to work on one individually, one step at a time. But I try to stick to that goal of foundations first, all the basic code in, and then any code that's after that is really extra and trying to add on to it, which most of it was. Most of the foundation stuff was done early on when and we didn't really have that many assets in the game yet, which focuses on enhancing the theme. We didn't really have too much level creation yet, so I think I stuck to this plan somewhat well. By the time we got to the asset section, where I was reinforcing the theme by adding in my own assets and models, at that point I was then starting to move on to level creation as well. So after creating the 3D models for the platforms, I then moved on to the level creation, and then did code alongside it, which is pretty standard. The foundation related code is usually, player movement and very basic functionality, and the coding usually happens during iteration 2 and 3, the major code, and all basic stuff should be in by then anyway. When we got to the 4th iteration, which is usually credits, story. The story, depending on what game you're doing, if you're doing a narrative game, story usually happens with level creation and asset creation. It kind of happens all the way through. Foundation's usually not, like the really basic code of player movement. That's usually discussed in the concept and even in the planning before the concept. But you've basically got, I didn't really focus on story at all, which is why it was the last iteration, and I just added that as more of a scenario description. It was just a description to help the player feel a little bit more immersed, but I don't usually like doing it, as I mentioned in that video, in the very last Game Jam video. That I don't like doing story like that because it really isn't very that immersive, and it's not really well done. But it was the best I could do with the time I had left. After that, we'll move on to now testing, where functional testing usually happens very early on after concept. Usually in concept you'll have some kind of way of doing some functionality testing, and sometimes that could be paper prototyping or really basic prototype. We had this kind of during the whole process of before the platform section. I was doing pretty much functionality testing all the way through, and when we come to major coding, like say the wave system and stuff, I always did that kind of functional testing. When we got to the later process, I then did beta testing, and just before release did beta testing, fix any bugs that immediately come up. Regression testing is something you usually do after release, or kind of something you do after noticing any bugs that it's usually just after release, and when you add in new features into a game, maybe after it's already released, you'll do regression testing to make sure it's not broken any previous code or broken any new code. So I haven't really done that. There's no need for me to do it because this was only for a game jam for 11 days. So if I want to go over it and I want to introduce new levels and things, then I would do regression testing along with the beta and functional beta testing, and then probably functional testing if I introduced any new code, new functions that are major. So after that, it was generally the let's evaluate the whole thing and even the feedback section. So I was a bit disappointed because I didn't really get any feedback. I asked a few friends to give me some feedback on it as well, and they did just that. It's unfortunate that no one in the game jam gave any feedback, but we did get a couple of plays. Like I said, a few friends played it, gave me some feedback over it, and there was some very interesting things that overall it was pretty positive. They enjoyed it, but they felt like it was maybe a bit too easy. The waves weren't as diverse. They would like them to spawn differently, different type of enemies and things, and it just came down to time. So overall I was pretty happy with it. I was happy with the game jam. I really enjoyed it. It's a lot of fun. It was different than I'm used to, because usually I make 2D games and this was a 3D game, and so it was different. But overall, yeah, I really enjoyed it. I'd probably make another 3D game at some point. I think there was so much more I could have done, but with the time I had left, I think I did what I could. And so I'm happy with it. There wasn't too many bugs, there wasn't too many issues. I managed to fix a lot, and there were so many changes going on throughout the process, more than usual with this game jam, that I was pretty happy with it in the end. So yeah, that's my review on the game. Stick around for any more game jams. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.